camera deep under this oil rig, and they spotted this thing with these insane long appendages.
American Kensington wasn't the kind of man who cracked under pressure. On the Poseidon rig, one knew that. Arms went off or steel screamed under stress. Didn't rush. He swear. Breathed with a calm that made other divers feel safer just standing near him. The crew called him the Ghost. Always there when things went wrong. Somehow, he always brought people back alive. Here before the incident, Rob had already pulled 3 divers out of situations that should have killed them. Snapped umbilical line wrapped around the valve. Panicked rookie tangled in debris at depth. Blackout during decompression. Every case, Robert stayed steady. Shaking hands, no rushed breathing. Focus. You don't train, you're with. He stumbled into Captain Reeves's office that afternoon, dripping seawater onto the gray industrial carpet. Instantly felt Robert wasn't injured. Suit wasn't torn. Pages were fine. Hands were shaking so badly he could barely unzip his gear. Breathing came in short, bursts like he'd sprinted the length of the rig. Eyes didn't look scared. Emptied out. Something had reached inside and scraped him clean. Saying a word, he pulled a sheet of paper from his suit pocket and slammed it onto the metal desk. Resignation. Immediately. Reeves stared at it, back at Robert, for the punchline that never came. Men quit before. Inflation does that. Exhaustion. This wasn't frustration or burnout. Something deeper. Bonds pushed a chair toward him, telling him to sit, to slow down. Assumed it was nitrogen narcosis. The Meany effect. Ends to even the best divers. Steps time. Brain starts lying to you. See things. You feel watched. Panic over nothing. Robert shook his head before Reeves even finished sentence. His mix was perfect. His depth was rolled. His mind was clear. Then he said the one thing that made the room go cold. The problem, whispered, wasn't confused. Wasn't frantic. Steady. He wished he'd hallucinated. His brain had failed. It had, then he saw wouldn't matter. He written off. Robert knew the difference between panic and perception. Whatever happened during that dive did break his focus, shattered his certainty. Captain Reeves straight in the eye and said, something down there knows we're here. The room went quiet. Pain that pressed on your chest. Tried to laugh it off. Ground the moment. Robert didn't react. Argue. Stood there, pulling at his feet. Man who had already made it out of something no one else could see. Strangest part, the dive that broke him wasn't dangerous. No malfunction. Emergency. Stake. Paper, it was one of the easiest dives of his career. Begs question happened down there that could undo a man who never panicked. The dive itself wasn't supposed to be memorable. It was a routine inspection, the kind that barely registers in a diver's memory once it's done. A pipeline junction at Sector 7, a section of steel and valves bolted into the seafloor beneath a rig that had been checked dozens of times before. Corporate wanted confirmation after minor pressure fluctuations showed up in the system. Nothing urgent, nothing dramatic, just a box to tick before the next report went out. Under normal circumstances, it would have been a 2-man job. Safety rules demanded a buddy system, no exceptions. But that morning, Robert's usual partner didn't show. Johnson had called in sick, severe stomach issues, or so the message said. He'd be in his bunk all day. No diving, no questions. The timing was inconvenient, but not unheard of. Life on a rig isn't gentle, and food poisoning spreads fast in close quarters. The problem was the pressure from above. Corporate wanted eyes on that junction immediately. A delay meant paperwork, explanations, and the risk of fines if something worse was discovered later. Captain Reeves didn't like it, but the solution was obvious. Robert would go in as the working diver, and a fully suited standby diver would stay topside, ready to deploy if anything went wrong. Surface support would monitor his air, his depth, and his comms the entire time. Robert didn't hesitate. In fact, he preferred it that way. No chatter in the line, no rookie partner to babysit, just him, the equipment, and the job. He'd done solo working dives before, clean and efficient, the kind that paid well and ended quiet. He entered the water at exactly 2 p.m. Conditions were nearly perfect. Visibility stretched close to 60 feet, unusually clear for that sector. Sunlight sliced down through the water in long cathedral-like beams, illuminating the rig's skeletal structure below. Schools of fish moved lazily around the metal legs. Groupers hovered in the shadows. Everything looked alive, normal, comforting. As he descended, Robert felt that familiar rhythm settle in. Breath, check gauges, equalize, descend. The surface noise faded, replaced by the muted hum of the rig vibrating through the water. It was the sound of routine, the sound of safety. He reached the pipeline junction right on schedule. Valves looked intact, no visible corrosion, no leaks. He took notes on his slate, snapped a few photos, and ran his checks with practice. He calculated his bottom time, planned his decompression stops, and mentally tallied his payout. 45 minutes down, straight into the chamber after. Easy money. This was the kind of dive where complacency sneaks in, where divers relax just enough to make mistakes, where nothing happens. And for the first 20 minutes, that's exactly how it felt. Until the ocean changed its mind. Because the sea is never truly quiet. There's always something. The crackle of shrimp, the distant thrum of machinery, the subtle movement of water over rock and steel. It's a constant living background noise that experienced divers don't even notice it. So when it stopped, Robert noticed immediately. Not gradual, not fading, instant. And in that sudden silence, the dive stopped feeling routine. It started feeling wrong. And whatever came next would prove that this wasn't just another inspection. It was an invitation. The first thing Robert noticed wasn't what appeared, it was what vanished. One moment, the water around the rig was alive. Schools of fish drifted between the metal beams. Small shapes darted in and out of shadow. The ecosystem was busy, noisy, predictable. The next moment, it was empty. Every fish was gone. Not just the big ones, not just the cautious ones. Even the tiny reef dwellers that never strayed far from their hiding spots had disappeared. The amberjacks vanished. The groupers fled. The water around the pipeline junction cleared, as if someone had erased life from the scene. Then came the silence. It wasn't peaceful. It wasn't calm. It was heavy. The kind of quiet that presses against your ears and makes your heartbeat feel too loud inside your own head. Robert could hear his own breathing echoing in his helmet, harsh and mechanical. He froze. 8 years of diving had trained him to recognize patterns, and this pattern had only one meaning. Something was coming. When reefs go silent, it's because a predator has entered the area. Usually a shark, sometimes something larger. Orcas maybe. Either way, the rule is the same. You don't wait around to find out. Every instinct in Robert's body screamed at him to abort the dive, ascend, get back to the cage, get away from open water. But his training fought back. There was no current shift, no sudden drop in visibility, no movement in the water. His gauges were stable. His depth was controlled. Logic told him this was nothing more than coincidence, a natural low, a trick of perception. So he did what experienced divers are trained to do. He ignored his instincts. He turned his back to the open ocean and focused on the job. That's when the feeling started. A prickle crawled up the back of his neck, sharp and electric. The same sensation humans have felt for thousands of years when they're being stalked, when something is close enough to study them. Robert felt exposed, not watched in passing, not observed, studied. He spun around, heart rate climbing, and swept his dive light through the darkening water. The beam cut through floating particles and distant shadows. It revealed empty blue-black space. No shark, no massive silhouette, no movement at all, just nothing. And somehow, that was worse. The feeling didn't fade, it intensified. It felt like pressure against his thoughts, like invisible eyes fixed on him from every direction at once. His heart rate monitor began to beep, slow at first, then faster. His breathing grew shallow. He was burning air at a rate that didn't match his workload. The silence wrapped tighter around him. This wasn't how predators hunted. This was something else. And as Robert hovered there, alone in that unnatural void, he realized the ocean hadn't gone quiet because something was passing through. It had gone quiet because something had arrived, and it didn't want to be interrupted. Robert made the decision to abort the dive. It wasn't panic, it was survival. No inspection was worth ignoring that kind of warning signal, especially not when the ocean itself felt like it was holding its breath. He reached for the comm switch on his helmet and keyed the mic. "Surface, this is Kensington. I'm aborting. Prepare for ascent." He expected the familiar crackle of static, the calm voice of the comms officer, maybe a question or two. Instead, he got nothing. No response. No interference. Just dead air. He tried again, slower this time. Same result. Robert checked the line by feel. The umbilical was still there, thick and solid, feeding him air and power. He glanced down at his panel. The comm system was live. No faults. No alerts. Everything said it should be working, but the surface might as well have been a different world. It felt like an invisible wall had dropped around him, cutting him off from every human voice above. A private pocket of ocean where nothing else exists. That's when the sense of isolation turned physical. The water felt heavy, not in pressure, but in presence, like something unseen had closed distance without disturbing the water around it. Robert's breathing sped up again, each inhale sounding too loud in the silence. Then the darkness beneath him changed. At first, it was subtle. A faint glow flickered far below the pipeline, deep in the trench that disappeared into blackness. Robert almost missed it, thinking it was a trick of his vision. Then it pulsed, soft, rhythmic, deliberate. The light wasn't coming from the surface, it was rising. It wasn't the chaotic shimmer of plankton or the quick flash of a jellyfish. This glow was steady, controlled, a blue-green luminance that seemed to push the darkness away rather than illuminate it. Robert's stomach dropped. Whatever this was, it was coming from far deeper than his working depth, from a place where pressure crushes steel and light doesn't belong. The glow grew larger as it ascended, moving faster than anything that size should be able to move underwater. There was no turbulence, no pressure wave, just smooth, impossible motion. Robert slammed his hand onto his buoyancy control, inflating his vest to rise away from it. His training screamed warnings in his head. Ascend too fast and the nitrogen in his blood would turn lethal. He couldn't flee the way his body wanted to. He was trapped between physics and fear, forced to rise slowly, while whatever was beneath him closed the distance with ease. As the glow reached the edge of his light, Robert finally understood something that made his chest tight. This wasn't approaching random. It was adjusting its speed, matching him. And for the first time since he entered the water, Robert realized the silence wasn't accidental. It was intentional. As Robert rose, the glow beneath him continued to expand, filling the trench with color that didn't belong in the deep. Blue-green light rippled outward, steady and controlled, like a pulse rather than a flare. It didn't scatter the darkness, it pushed against it. Then the shape emerged. At first, Robert couldn't make sense of what he was seeing. His brain reached for familiar patterns and found none. It wasn't a fish. It wasn't a machine. It was large, easily 20 feet across. But its size felt secondary to how how wrong it looked. The form was geometric, not smooth curves or streamlined edges like anything evolved to swim. This thing was made of shifting angles and planes, surfaces folding in on themselves, rotating and rearranging as if reality couldn't decide where its edges belonged. The structure moved without swimming, without propulsion. It simply occupied new positions in the water, skipping the space in between. Like a glitch, protrusions extended from its core, long appendages that might have been limbs or sensors or something else entirely. They didn't paddle or undulate. They repositioned, snapping into new configurations with quiet precision. The water around it remained undisturbed. No wake, no turbulence, no displacement. That's when Robert felt true fear settle in. Because the ocean has rules. Even the strangest creatures obey them. Pressure, drag, momentum. Break those rules and you're not dealing with biology anymore. The entity rose until it stopped roughly 30 feet below him, hovering in the water column, as if gravity had lost interest. It didn't advance, it didn't retreat. It waited. The light dimmed slightly, enough for Robert's dive lamp to catch more detail. The surfaces shimmered with an oily iridescence, colors sliding across angles that refused to stay still. It was beautiful in the way a storm looks beautiful when you realize it's headed straight for you. And then Robert saw the face. It didn't have eyes, not the way animals do. There was a smooth, reflective region near its center, a surface that absorbed light instead of reflecting. The longer he looked, the harder it became to focus on, like staring into deep water where depth perception fails. But he didn't need eyes to understand what was happening. The moment his light passed over that surface, the sensation of being watched intensified to something far worse. He wasn't being observed anymore. He was being recognized, not as prey, not as an obstacle, as an individual. The realization sent a cold shock through his body. This thing wasn't reacting to his presence. It had noticed him long before he noticed it. And as it hovered there in the silent water, Robert understood that the light wasn't a warning, it was an introduction.
American expected pain. He expected a sudden movement, a rush, some violent reaction that would at least make sense. Instead, nothing happened. The creature remained perfectly still beneath him, its shifting geometry slowing, the glow pulsing in a calm, almost patient rhythm. Then his thoughts stopped being private. There was no voice, no sound inside his head. What came instead was a flood of images, sharp and immediate, like memories forced into his mind without permission. He saw the pipeline junction below him, then the rig itself, the support vessel rocking gently on the surface. The images weren't imagined. They were precise, accurate, down to angles and distances Robert hadn't consciously noticed before. Then the images changed. Faces appeared. Captain Reese, Garcia from comms, Johnson, Peters. Every face was familiar, but the perspective was wrong. Each one was seen from below, as if viewed through dark water, looking up toward the light of the rig. The implication hit him like a blow to the chest. This thing hadn't just encountered him. It had been observing the rig, watching the crew for a long time. Robert's mind raced, trying to reject what he was experiencing. He searched for explanations: hypoxia, narcosis, stress hallucinations. But the images kept coming, relentless and coherent. Then he saw himself, not as a reflection, but as an external image. His own body suspended in the water, framed against the lattice of steel above. He was being shown exactly how exposed he was. That's when the understanding settled in. This wasn't communication in the human sense. It was assessment. The creature wasn't curious. It was evaluating, measuring, comparing. And Robert felt something else layered beneath the images. Familiarity. A creeping realization that made his stomach tight. The dreams he'd been having for weeks. The sensation of being watched during night shifts. The brief flashes of light at the edge of his vision he'd written off as exhaustion. They hadn't been stress. They had been proximity. The creature's presence was bleeding upward into his mind long before this dive ever began. This encounter wasn't random. It wasn't accidental. He hadn't been unlucky. He had been selected. As the images faded, another sensation replaced them. A pull. Subtle at first, then stronger. Not physical, but instinctive. A deep urge to drift downward, to close the distance between himself and that impossible light. Robert's hands tightened around the anchor line as his decompression stop began. A part of him wanted to let go, wanted to descend, wanted to know what it felt like to touch something that existed outside the rules of the ocean. The creature didn't move. It waited, because it knew time was on its side. Every instinct in Robert's body screamed at him to fight it, to resist, to rise and never look back. Yet another part of him, a darker, primal part, wanted to surrender, to drift closer, to reach out and touch the impossible. The light, the geometry, the alien symmetry. It wasn't just alien, it was intoxicating, hypnotic. For a terrifying moment, Robert understood the lure. This creature wasn't hunting in the way a shark hunts. It didn't need to chase. It could wait. It could watch. And it could bend the mind of anyone weak enough to ignore that warning, to follow the pull, to step into the abyss willingly. The longer he stared, the more he felt it
inside him. The desire to descend, to merge, to abandon the surface world entirely. He fought it with every ounce of his experience, every lesson drilled into him over years of deep dives. His training had always been about discipline, about knowing the ocean and respecting it. But this wasn't the ocean. This was something else, something that didn't obey the rules. Minutes stretched into eternity as he clung to the decompression line, his heart hammering in his chest. Every pulse of the glow, every subtle shift in its planes seemed to reach into him. He felt mirrored, studied, challenged. It was testing him, probing him, waiting for him to give in. And then he realized the cruel truth. This thing wasn't just observing, it was patient. It knew how to break a mind slowly, to lure, to tease, to entice, until resistance became impossible. Robert wanted to touch it. He wanted to see what it truly was. He wanted to understand. But fear, sharp and unyielding, edged just slightly ahead of that desire. It was the difference between survival and surrender. He ascended, slowly, agonizingly, every meter a battle against the pole. The light followed, maintaining its rhythm, matching his speed. It was close now, close enough that he could feel the weight of its presence, the intensity of its gaze, even through the water. And when he finally broke the trench and reached the safe, shallower zone, the entity paused. It didn't pursue further. It didn't vanish. It hung there in the blue-black water, still pulsing, still alive in a way that defied explanation. It had let him go, or at least that's what he told himself, because he knew better than anyone that in the deep, the ocean never releases anything completely. He wasn't free, not truly. He was just part of the pattern now, observed, marked, not yet taken. And as he reached the surface, gasping for air that felt suddenly thin and heavy, Robert understood something else. Whoever or whatever he had faced, it wasn't alone in its patience. It was waiting, always waiting. And the others, Johnson, Peters, the crew, they weren't safe, not by a long shot. Americans' relief on surfacing was brief. He'd escaped physically, but the real danger was just beginning. Johnson, Peters, names that should have felt safe, ordinary, part of the crew's rhythm. But after what Robert had seen, they didn't. He thought of Johnson first, the man who had called in sick that morning, forcing Robert into the solo dive. At the time, it seemed like coincidence, bad timing, bad luck. Now, it was chillingly obvious it was no accident. He pressed Reeves for information. Where was Johnson? Had he seen him that morning? Reeves' stomach sank as he realized he had it. The last anyone had actually laid eyes on Johnson was the night before. The note about food poisoning was relayed secondhand. No one had verified it. A quick call to Johnson's quarters confirmed the worst. Empty, gear gone, bed untouched. A man with food poisoning doesn't vanish into thin air, and he certainly doesn't take his dive suit. Robert swallowed hard, his chest tightening. The implication was impossible. Johnson hadn't just disappeared. He had walked into the water, into the same abyss that had almost claimed Robert. Then Peters came into focus. 3 days earlier, Peters had taken emergency leave according to the paperwork. A supply boat supposedly took him to the mainland, but Reeves could not recall actually seeing Peters leave. And the records? Conflicting, incomplete, strangely hollow. When the supply boat was contacted, the captain insisted Peters had never boarded. Empty rooms, vanishing gear, disappearing men. The pattern was undeniable. This wasn't random. This wasn't misfortune. This wasn't an accident. The creature Robert had glimpsed in the deep wasn't just a predator. It was a strategist, a hunter with patience beyond human comprehension. It didn't need to strike violently or chase recklessly. It didn't rely on brute force. It harvested slowly, psychologically, drawing its prey in through dreams, through hallucinations, through subtle manipulation until they walked willingly into the abyss. Johnson had gone last night. Peters 3 days before. How many others had been taken before anyone realized what was happening? And Robert knew something else that no one else realized. He survived not because he was stronger or luckier or better prepared. He survived because the pull of that impossible light had been resisted by mere fractions of instinct over desire. The others hadn't resisted, and in that realization, a cold truth settled over him. The abyss didn't need to hunt the living like sharks. It didn't need to destroy. It waited, it marked, and it claimed its prey in ways that left no evidence, just empty beds, missing gear, and whispers of an ocean that had grown silently lethal. Robert looked out at the churning black water beyond the rig. The blue-green glow lingered, faint but persistent, a beacon calling to anyone weak enough to answer. The harvest was still underway, and it would not stop. Robert finally understood the scale of what he was facing. This wasn't about hunger. It wasn't a territorial dispute. This was methodical, deliberate, and terrifyingly intelligent. The creature didn't need to chase its prey. It influenced them before they even entered the water. Dreams became its whispers, shadows at the edge of vision, unexplained chills that prickle on the back of the neck. Everything was a lure. It preyed on the mind first, shaping fear, curiosity, and fascination until the line between waking and hallucination blurred. Johnson, Peters, they hadn't been taken by accident. They had been drawn in, step by step, until the pull of the abyss became irresistible. The lights, the visions, the slow
slow psychological erosion. It was the predator's method, and it had been doing this long before Robert ever hit the water. Robert had almost fallen for it himself. He admitted later that he wanted to touch it. He wanted to reach out, to see the impossible up close. It called to him, showing flashes of the rig, the crew, even himself, distorted in ways the human eye shouldn't comprehend. And yet, somewhere in the fight between instinct and fascination, fear won just enough to pull him away. But the stakes were clear. For everyone else, the margin for survival didn't exist. The creature's patience was infinite. It would wait days, weeks, even months if necessary, shaping minds with subtle manipulations until its prey walked willingly into its waiting grasp. And Robert realized the horrifying truth. This was bigger than a dive, bigger than a rig, bigger than one isolated encounter. It wasn't just hunting humans, it was harvesting them. Each disappearance, each accidental drowning, each vanishing diver was part of a pattern, a collection, a slow, methodical culling. The abyss wasn't empty, it had rules, and the crew had unknowingly stepped into them. Robert survived because he resisted, but surviving didn't mean he was safe. Not entirely. He had been marked, observed, studied, and somewhere in the depths, the creature remembered him. As he looked back at the dark water, the whole reality hit him. They weren't alone. They had never been alone. The ocean wasn't just a world to explore or a resource to exploit. It was occupied. It was alive. And it was patient. Robert never dove again. Not for inspection, not for fun, not even near a swimming pool. The ocean had claimed too much of his mind, and he refused to give it another opportunity. He moved inland to a small town in Nevada, far from the nearest coastline. The sun was hot, dry, unyielding, everything the water was not. He traded wetsuits for work boots and construction gear. Waves were replaced with dust, tides with heat. And yet, even here, the past clung to him. Showers replaced baths. He avoided lakes. Rivers made him tense. Anything that reminded him of the water brought a cold pressure to his chest, a faint prickle at the back of his neck. But even on land, he couldn't escape it entirely. At night, the dreams came. They were vivid, undeniable. His bedroom filled with water. Pressure built from floor to ceiling. The same pulsing blue-green light emerged in the corner, unfolding impossible limbs. The visions repeated. Johnson, Peters, floating in the depths, watching, waiting, changed, merged with the geometry of the abyss. Robert knew they weren't dead. They were transformed, part of the harvest. And if he ever returned to the ocean, they, or whatever had taken them, would be waiting. Meanwhile, back on the Poseidon rig, the official reports told another story. 3 more divers accidentally drowned in the months after Robert left. Equipment failed, safety violations. Sector 7 was closed for maintenance. Nothing was mentioned about missing divers, hypnotic lights, or intelligent geometry in the abyss. Robert understood the truth. The pipeline was fine. The rig was intact. The ocean wasn't broken. It was occupied. And it was patient. Even far from the water, he felt the pull, the lights, the pressure, the intelligence that had marked him, teaching him a terrifying lesson. Survival didn't mean freedom. Every storm, every still day, every moment of silence reminded him. Maybe he hadn't escaped at all. Maybe he was simply a messenger now, carrying a warning from the depths. And the ocean, the beautiful, calm surface reflecting sunlight, that was alive. Beneath it, the geometry waited. The harvest continued. And the question lingered. If the ocean had been watching humans for millions of years, learning, observing, waiting, what had changed now? Why were they rising? Robert Kentington didn't have the answer. He only knew this. The creatures weren't gone. They were patient. They were intelligent. And the moment they marked someone, that pull never truly released them. So, if you ever feel that prickle at the back of your neck near water, or catch the faint glow in the corner of your eye, don't look. Don't question it. Run. Because once it marks you, it doesn't stop calling. And some calls are impossible to ignore.